Hi everyone, and it's been a while since my last update, so I thought I'll catch you up on the latest progress with this Jeep and its engine rebuild and in reinstallation. So as you can see, we've got some really good news. The latest milestone is that the 4.7 litre V8 is now sitting safely on its engine mounts and made it to the bell housing off the transmission. There's some accessories added too, which I've added since, but I think the big thing to take into account when you're installing one of these engines, solo especially, is it's not easy. You do have to do some preparation work. The first thing I definitely recommend is making sure you get all the wires out of the way and clear as much of a clear space as possible. I installed this without accessories. The only accessories I fitted were the water pump, but I left the intake manifold off, left the PCV and oil filler tube off, I left the front crankshaft dampener or harmonic balancer off, and I left the power steering pump off as well. I did install it with the headers, so you want to install it with the headers and their covers on. You want to install it with the engine mounts on, and that's pretty much all you probably go with. I installed it with the cylinder heads and valve covers on as well, so that probably gives you enough to get clearance, but also doesn't make it too hard to add parts on later. The second thing I learnt is to get the transmission to mate to the engine block. It's still, even after lowering it in, it's still not easy to get it mated properly. You'll probably notice if you do try and do this by yourself that either there's a bit of a gap between the transmission and its torque converter and your crankshaft nose. So to get them closer together, I used a long threaded bolt, one on each side of the engine at the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock positions at the ears of the engine, and ran that through to the transmission, the similar threaded area of the transmission. I put a bolt and some washers on either side and basically torqued the two together. That helped bring the two closer together, and I did it progressively on each side until I could make the crankshaft to the torque converter. So that helped a lot. The other thing is, you'll probably also notice when you're bringing an engine and using a lift like this, even if you're using the load leveling attachment and the two attachment points and long bolts that come with the engine, even if you use those, you'll find that the engine actually leans forwards because of the weight of the timing gears. So it will actually lean forwards, and the rear of the engine will actually not mate up that easily with the front of the transmission. So you need to find a way, if you're working solo, to lower the engine, the rear of the engine down. So I think you can do all sorts of things, but I think the best thing I found was using some ratcheting straps. So I attached the main weight of the engine was held by this load leveler here at the two lifting points as per the factory manual, and the two long bolts that come with the engine anyway. And then I tied the ratcheting strap around the rear of the bell housing in such a way where it would actually force the weight of the engine downwards at the rear, and I ran the ratchet straps over the top of this part here and used that to adjust the angle of the engine as I needed. So that helped, and I'll show a video of me doing. And then the last thing I think is to try and get the angle of the transmission to mate with the engine. Once you've got the engine's angle facing downwards, the next thing you need to do is look at the mount at the cross member here. That engine mount just sitting there, that engine transmission mount, that single rubber bushing. There's a one long bolt running through that. I removed that and jacked the transmission up as well to give it a bit more angle. And then I looked at, mainly focused look at getting the engine mated to the transmission bell housing as a first priority. Then I looked at how it would sit with the actual engine mount, front mounts, and their brackets in the frame. That was the second priority. And then the third thing was, once you get the engine mounts lined up in the brackets, don't put the long bolts through yet. Focus on getting all the bell housing bolts in first, and then you're pretty safe. But I wouldn't disconnect the lifting attachment or anything yet. Then what you want to do is keep the lifting attachment attached to the engine, even once the bell housing bolts are all done up, and then use the lifting attachment to lift the engine up again, keeping it in the same plane as those two brackets. Lift it up probably maybe 2 or 3 inches, and use that extra room to try and get in the rear cover plate or the rear inspection plate for the just that rear inspection plate there. That's probably the hardest thing to get in, and that's the last thing. You want to leave that off until you actually install the engine and the bell housing bolts. So you need to lift the engine up to clear the exhaust. So lift the engine up 2 or 3 inches. That'll give you enough room to get that in there and torque those up, and also enough room to actually mate the flex plate or bolt down the flex plate to the torque converter as well. So use that room to do that. Then you can safely lower the engine on its mount, and put the long bolts through the mounts here. So that'll get you there, and you'll be able to do that. And then the next step will be to actually mate the Y pipe here for the exhaust to the headers. And so I did that. You might see this here with some studs. So I actually, instead of using the factory bolts, I actually did some studs, or bought some studs, some 78mm or 78mm studs, 3/8 inch threads, UNC. I ran those through and used bolts on nuts on either side to try and make it a little bit easier to remove that in the future. And that extra use of studs actually helped lining the two up. So I used the jack underneath the Y pipe to lift the Y pipe up, and then use the studs to try and studs with nuts to try and attach the two together. So that's the main things I learned from this whole part of it. Once you've done that, it's pretty easy to attach the oil filler and PCV. I've got a new PCV here. It's just those 4 there, and they are done up to 12 Newton meters, I believe, or 12 foot-pounds. And then power steering pump. I've got a new refurbished power steering pump from Rock Auto with a new pulley. So that was pretty easy to install. I put the pump on first, and then I installed the pulley on using a press tool. And I'll show you that press tool now. A couple of tools that will come really handy to install your harmonic balancer and your power steering pulley if you need to do those things. The first one is this part here, or tool here, which is a harmonic balancer installer. It's really important to use that tool so you don't damage the crankshaft threads. If you try and use other means, you might damage the crankshaft or the threads, or the harmonic balancer. And the other one is this pulley installer kit here, which worked great for that power steering pulley install, and I'm sure works well for the removal as well. And the next thing I've done is I've filled up the new oil filter, primed it, and added. It took quite a bit of oil, so that's pretty good. And then I've installed, torqued down the spark plugs, and test fitted the injectors. And I will get those injectors cleaned before I actually install that. That'll be about a $200 cost, but worth doing once, and not running the risk of flooding the engine with fuel. And then the next thing was the intake manifold, and that took a bit of fitting. It's a pretty tight fit. I had to, my firewall, this thin metal here, is a little bit thin, so I had to actually just bend that up a little bit to get this in. So it had actually collapse down a bit, but that got in nicely. And then there's 10 bolts, 8 of them are studs, and you have to actually follow the manual for where you put those studs. So you'll see the ones that aren't studs go here and in the back corner there. But the rest are all studs. And then we've got connected up the dipstick tube up to the manifold. Still got the transmission filler tube sitting there, and I've installed the heater hoses, and so those are running all down to the back. If you don't know which way they go, the lower one here connects to the right hand side one here. So the one that's on the right here is the lower one there. So that's the way they go. And so yeah, that's where we're at the moment. So the next steps are, and it's going to be a bit of a jumble getting these electrical connectors up, but I've actually made some coding for each one. So I put some tape on each one and put a bit of a code. So hopefully I'll be able to find the stickers and actually make them all up again. And once that's done, I'll install some throttle body, which I've got sitting down here. I've got the oil compressor the AC compressor still attached, so that will just fit right across the engine here. I've got the alternator to install. Once I've started to get those parts in, I'll look at actually connecting up the hydraulic hoses up to the cooling fan and radiator system. So I'll install those as well. So yeah, a bit to do still, but light at the end of the tunnel. So next update will hopefully be once everything's put together, and we'll be ready for the first start. So see you then.